whole discussion about industrial and technology policies for the formal and informal sectors. And we actually put some of this together for the Fair Trade Alliance in the Philippines, and I wrote a book on it and that sort of thing. But in any event, today, because we only have 10 minutes, and because we're talking about gender, I really wanted to focus on this area of local knowledge and technology blending. And this slide is to remind me to emphasize that students really like this topic. And they would like to go forward with it, but as we say, there's no reward in it. There's very little that you can do with a PhD having worked in this area. And they would go forward with it if they could, but in gender development studies, they are kind of, well, they ended up looking at IT and gender, or engineering and gender, and very few people actually work in this area, but I think it's important, again, within the broader context of industrial and technology policies for the informal economy. So, in any event, this presentation was on indigenous knowledge, traditional medicines, and gender dimensions in China and Myanmar. And I thought it was very interesting because it starts to bring out some of the gender dimensions. So, next slide. I think it's also important in this discussion to talk about the difference between the big and little traditions of local knowledge or indigenous knowledge, or whatever you want to say. We can also call it great tradition and folk tradition. We really need new ways of designating the two traditions. But in any event, their discussion was about the great tradition of medical systems in China, traditional Chinese medicine, and also the folk tradition in Myanmar, which is a medical systems, but not in the great tradition way. The difference between the two is really that, of course, the great traditions like Ayurvedic and traditional Chinese medicine and so on are well established. They've been going on for many for a very long time. They're hierarchical. They have certification systems, and so on. They have formal and informal aspects in the supply chain within these great tradition forms of indigenous knowledge. But if you look at it, in most countries, it's mostly male-dominated, and in some of the informal areas, you'll get women, but you don't get too many of them. And most of the awards and the recognition and subsidies and so on usually go to these great traditions, and it's usually men who are rewarded and become the national living treasures and that sort of thing. In Myanmar, the case that was presented in this presentation by the two students from Myanmar was more the folk tradition format, and that involves more the indigenous knowledge in more remote areas, maybe ethnic minorities, and it's not as well accepted by national mainstream, by the national elites, and it's not rewarded in the same way, but it's certainly important, I think, in the realm of innovation. And here you find many more women involved. And in fact, you find even more women involved these days, because a lot of men gravitate towards industrial jobs in the cities, and women then become the sustainers, the sustaining force for this type of indigenous knowledge. Okay, so, all right, next. Oh, okay, sorry. I'm not going to really talk about this, but we have gone through a long period of devaluing of both the great and folk traditions for many reasons. But there's been a renewed interest in recent years, and this is because there's been a recognition that there are a lot of commercial implications, a lot of commercial applications of the two forms of indigenous knowledge, particularly the great tradition type of indigenous knowledge, because it's already developed for commercial reasons, and it can be further developed, often through technology blending, to commercialize it. And on the folk tradition side, it's a little bit harder to commercialize it, because a lot of the folk traditions of indigenous knowledge are not originally for commercial purposes. But there have been lots of cases of companies trying to then not only transform the great tradition types of indigenous knowledge, but also the folk tradition. For example, in the 1990s, a lot of the pharmaceutical firms went all over the world, and they particularly targeted women because women become then the sustainers of a lot of this type of knowledge. So this Medicine Woman project, in fact, involved many projects of trying to extract this knowledge from women and then be able to take it to the laboratory and commercialize it. I'm not sure how much the women got out of this, but it was certainly an important development over the last 20 years. Okay. I think there was a slide, sorry, right? Oh, sorry. All right, let's move on to the informal settings then. A lot of examples can be given of how technology blending has been used by informal practitioners, not necessarily for the type of, with the goal of profitability, which is the formal setting goal. But in the case of informal settings, rather than profitability, the focus is on serving local needs and providing sustainable livelihoods. So here, rather than it being private enterprise oriented, it's usually more social enterprises and cooperatives and local groups and networks and so on that are involved in this type of use of local knowledge and technology blending. And there are many, many examples of this. So, for example, waste pickers have used a lot of technology blending in order to be able to maintain their jobs and serve local needs, neighborhood needs, and also then move into recycling so that they're able to even expand their realm of activities, again, with the goal of serving local needs and providing themselves sustainable livelihoods, because they're in danger of losing their livelihoods with the rise of multinational corporations in garbage collection and recycling, incinerators and so on. So I think this is very important. Agroforestry is a good example of how a lot of local groups are able to do technology blending to serve their own needs as opposed to strictly profit-oriented requirements. I mean, with an emphasis again on livelihoods rather than necessarily maximizing profitability. Ethnomedicine, complementary medicine, I mean, there are many, many countries in which the informal practitioners have been able to use technology blending in this field. And I won't go into detail, but one of my favorite examples is even ethnopsychiatry. There are very nice examples of ethnopsychiatry here in Thailand and Cambodia and Indonesia and most other places. So I think this is an area that I wouldn't like to ignore. It's quite interesting how the ideas from the top and the bottom can be combined in ways that serve the local population, in ways that technology or knowledge from entirely different places cannot. It just doesn't serve their needs. So there are a lot of good examples here. All right, the role of women's organizations, I think, is very important. Women who are by the way, up to this point, particularly in the folk traditions, we're talking about both women and men, but increasingly women. And in places where women have been organized into groups, into organizations and networks, I think this promotion of technology blending has gone particularly far. And we find it in all countries. We find it in informal craft production in most places. We also find it in rural employments. Salt production is a very, very good example. In things like preventive medicine, midwifery, nutritive local food processing. This is, well, I could go into detail about all of these examples. But the point is that when you organize, you have access to information in a way that an individual does not. And in this case, we're talking about a lot of women who are in isolated home-based production and do not have a lot of public areas to meet with others. And when they're organized and brought together, they have information, access to information and technology and inputs from universities and research institutes and so on. And so I think the organizations have played a very critical role as intermediaries. And again, there are a lot of examples of that. I'm running out of time. Okay. They do run into sources of resistance. Naturally, there is resistance from men in some cases. There's resistance from commercial enterprises and so on. But again, with organizations, they're able to meet this resistance. And particularly if they get support from other organizations, from government organizations, from design institutes, from universities, research institutes, and so on. So again, I want to stress the importance of the organization and how it acts as an intermediary between some of the types of institutions here and represented here, but also then the community, very community-based organizations. There's obviously a lot more to say, but I think we can talk about this over the next couple of days. And in any event, my pitch is that I wouldn't forget the area of informal, the area of indigenous knowledge and technology blending, even though probably the focus in this group is going to be kind of more application of science and technology and appropriate technology and so on. There's also a lot to learn from the bottom. And particularly when we're talking about women and marginalized men, they have a lot to share and they have a lot to build on. So thank you.